All right, so you may have remembered from last week, I started to introduce you to this concept of faithing and how it's different from faith, how we think about faith, not just as a noun, but also as this concept of a verb. And I've tried to turn that concept in some different and creative and theological ways that I hope has evoked your interest and has tied it into some of the literature that you've been reading. And this week, I want to take this a little bit further. Like, what do we actually mean by faithing? I mean, it's a nice concept. We see it, I suppose, in the ways that we look at the scriptures. We understand that there's something forming and developing. But the great news is this, is that there's actually been some research done that actually delves in a little bit deeper into this. And you've probably already seen glimpses of this through your readings in Sherilyn Dallas Parks' book. She refers to James Fowler and other developmental theorists that have thought about this idea of faith development. Now, just a little caveat for those of you that may have a psychological background. These developmental theorists oftentimes sort of present things in a linear form, as though there's one stage that goes to the next stage and just sort of graduate along the way. There's an element of truth to that in the ways that we think about our lives or the ways that we develop. But most of these theorists would also say that it's not really a linear progression as much as it's a spiral progression, where we're moving slowly in a direction, but sometimes having to circle back and renegotiate or create new meaning with a past experience or the way I thought about something, and then I'm sort of slowly moving forward. So allow yourself some grace as you see some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. I'm here. You're not moving from one thing to the next as much as you're slowly spiraling and moving in a direction of which we're moving forward and then having to come back to renegotiate some things and then move things forward. And hopefully that'll make more sense as I begin to talk about this. So when we talk about emerging adulthood faith and faith development, I want to step a little bit further back and kind of give you a bigger picture, and then we'll home in on emerging adults in particular. In particular, we remember that faith is more like this noun sort of process, and then we have this idea of faithing, which is more verb-like in nature. It's moving, changing, becoming, which begs some different deeper questions of, well, what does this actually mean? Like, where is it going, and how do we think about it? You remember from the reading of our passage and Peter, the rock of the church sinking. We see that throughout the scriptures and throughout church history, and even in the lives of those that we interact with, that there is this dynamic changing and forming that happens along the way. We might say that there are moments where it looks like Peter failed, but it's not like his life failed. It's as though the faithfulness of God somehow worked in some powerful ways, and he sort of became over time with the highs and lows that come with that. And so one of the ways that we can think about this is to step back and think about the fact that when we think about followers' stages of faith, there's actually different particular sort of moments in a person's developmental life where they're actually constructing some different things. Now, I'm going to give you like a really cursory, big picture thing, but then I want to focus in on a couple of things. Fowler talks about this idea of this intuitive projective, and this is sort of the stage found in preschool where children and the family, like faith is discovered through a family experience, okay? So when I'm a child and I look up into my parents' eyes or an adult that I trust eyes or their face, I smile and I feel this sense of comfort because they're bigger than me. And this world is really, really big and really, really scary. And so what a parenting figure does, that attachment and everything else, it gives them this sense of security and knowing that there's someone that's bigger and taking care of them. Now, what's interesting about that is that sometimes in some of our worship songs or whatever, we talk about God being big, right? Maybe you remember like when you were a kid, that song, "My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty. There's nothing my God cannot do," right? Like for a young child, that's really, really important, right? Like God is bigger than the scary things in the world. God protects me. You know, there's nothing my God cannot do, right? And I think sometimes if you listen to worship songs and otherwise, you sort of still hear this, right? Like God's super big and God's bigger and can handle any of your problems. You know, God's bigger than any of your problems, et cetera, et cetera. There's an amount of truth to that. And it's also age appropriate that a young, a very young child would think about this. There's nothing wrong with adults holding to this perspective, but there's also some limitations to that as well, right? Like a relationship with God is not really God just running around beating up all our problems or anything that we think is like scary to us, right? Certainly God is powerful, and there's more to our relationship with God and all that comes with that, right? Which really moves to this next phase that a follower talks about, and he calls it the mythical literal, or we could simplify this to the literalist. Okay, this begins about when the child is 6, and they begin to organize and categorize their thoughts as they embrace the stories of the Bible. Okay, so think about this for a second. This is the space where oftentimes young children are sort of enraptured by the stories of the Bible. I remember when my girls were really little, we had a children's Bible, and we would start at the beginning and we would read through each of the stories. And at the end of sort of the reading of the whole Bible, I'd have them sign their name and we would date it, and then we would start over again. So it was really kind of this beautiful sort of chronicling of us reading through this children's Bible with them. But at night, I would be getting our kids ready for bed or whatever, and they would say to me, "Oh, please, Dad, read the Bible. Please, Dad, read the Bible." Right? And I felt like the best dad ever, right? Like my kids like want to read the Bible. Now, if I knew a little bit more about Fowler at that point, I would recognize the fact that they just love hearing stories, right? Because they can almost see themselves in the stories, and it's very, very true to them. So for a literalist, something is true because they can actually see themselves in the story. Now, this is really appropriate for when a child is about age 6-ish, but there are some adults that actually still hold to this form of faithing. And you might see a bumper sticker in the back of a car or something that says, "The Bible says it, I believe it," and that settles it, right? Maybe you've talked with someone who said, "Well, the church that I go to, we just preach the Bible. That's all we do. There's nothing, there's no culture, there's no lenses, there's no whatever. We read it and we just do it," right? And so there's some limitations to that for obvious reasons, right? We know that the scriptures are filled with all sorts of genre. We know that history matters. We know that language matters. We know that the ways that we even engage and encounter the scriptures are dependent on context and culture and all that comes with that, right? That's what we're sort of studying as seminarians, right? But for some adults, like it works in their lives to treat the Bible quite literally, and that's the way that they look at it. So you can see what happens. It's something that's very age appropriate for a 6-year-old. But if that's the only way that an adult holds the scriptures, it becomes and faith, it becomes quite inflexible. And any form of anything diverging from that almost feels unfaithful to them. Okay. Now, the next stage is the synthetic conventional stage, and we could call this the loyalist stage. And this is often the teenage years. This is where group expectations and conformity are powerful and influential. Okay. This is a stage where something is true because a personality or authority figure says it's true, or it's true because we all believe it's true. Okay, so think of the power of this for a teenager. If I show up in youth group and we all are together singing the same songs, holding on to the same sort of message, there's something that's quite encouraging and uplifting about recognizing the fact that I'm not alone. And we can almost think that something is true simply because we all agree on it. So it's got to be true, right? Or if there's an authority figure in my life, oftentimes a youth leader or youth pastor that has been significant to me. If they say something is true, they're the closest picture I have to Jesus, I'm going to believe that it's true. So a loyalist really looks at truth in that sort of way. We know when it comes to the loyalist position that this is very appropriate and common for a teenager. But also some adults still hold to this particular phase as well. And we can, as you see here, among adults, this stage is the most common among church members. The loyalist seeks to preserve the culture that's part of the church. So for an adult who's a loyalist, oftentimes they will do whatever they need to do to protect their community and their church. Because something is true, because we all believe it, because something is true, because the pastor said it. And so there's a protective nature that sort of comes with this space. They will do faithfully the work of the church because probably they were asked by an authority figure to do so. And sometimes this is actually reinforced for good and bad purposes, where we see someone like, oh, there's Auntie Jill. We love her around this church because throughout her time here, she has done everything we've asked her to do, right? Now, there's something really encouraging about that, and there's something else about that kind of going, everything? Like that's her role here, to do what you ask her to do? Might there be more to faithing than just that? So here we have to be really, really careful with hero worship. We find this a lot in maybe popular voices or certain churches where the voice of the person is really significant. If that person were to leave, people will pick up and go find another popular voice. In many ways, these are sort of, I would suggest, those are signs and symptoms of being in the loyalist stage. Now, back to teenagers for a second. If you have a teenager and there's a youth pastor or youth leader that's significant in their lives, and that youth leader or youth pastor, for whatever reason, leaves for whatever reason, right? A lot of times a teenager can have a crisis of faith because the authority figure that they had trusted, that has been somehow creating a culture for them, has changed, and this can be a crisis of faith for them as well, which is really, really challenging for us as youth leaders, I think, to think about this. Like, if you choose to leave, like, there's two things that are really, really important in pastoring: starting well and leaving well. Both are really significant because teenagers are really impacted by that. Now, if we move on, I'm going to keep moving here. The individuative reflective phase is what we could also call the critic phase. Okay, this is late teens, early 20s. They hold themselves and others to a higher accountability for authenticity, congruence, and consistency. And this is actually the most difficult stage for young people, because this is the place where they become to challenge their own assumed beliefs about how the world works. And they begin to challenge that of the community that has brought them up, okay? So something is true for them because it makes sense. So this is where oftentimes you just have a lot of emerging adults in this particular space that ask the why questions, right? Well, why do we do things this way? Why do we value this social issue but not this social issue? Why do we always sing these songs and not other songs? Why do we give money to this and not that, right? These are the things that are sort of going on in their minds, and they're really asking these really important questions. And so what they begin to do is question the assumptions of their community, which is a part of faithing. But think about what that does for them as an individual, right? The people that they love and trust and have brought them up, they are now saying, the only way I can really think about my faithing is to actually question the very assumptions that have brought me and gotten me to this point, right? Scary, exciting, all wrapped up in one. As we move to the conjunctive and universalizing phases, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this. The conjunctive, another term for that is the seer. This is the stage where all of a sudden life and truth begin to be more complex, but they're able to hold this sense of tension associated with that. And then the universalizing is, Fowler would say, this is kind of where, Mother Teresa, Jesus, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King, they're sort of in that category. Like, the whole thing is sort of coming together and everything is completely integrated. Okay, so why is this so important? Well, if we think about it, if we look particularly at the critic stage, we see that what is actually happening is, in this particular view from Fowler's stages of faith, the individuative reflective or critic stage is sort of one phase in his realm. Sharon Dallas Parks comes along and she takes Fowler's one stage and she divides it into two. Okay, she actually says there's two movements in this particular stage, which is really, really important. She calls it's like the high school emerging adult, and then like full on sort of mid to late emerging adult, and then we move to the tested adult, was what she would talk about, right? And so you can begin to see that she's sort of breaking this apart. And what she's saying is what we see in the beginning of the individuative reflective stage, is that in high school and early emerging adulthood, faith is challenging the community's assumptions. It holds themselves to a higher accountability, and this is super difficult. But eventually what happens is, as they continue to move in this particular stage, they move to sort of more of the positive side, where they begin to not only question their own beliefs, but they begin to learn to take responsibility for their own thinking and knowing, right? So what happens, I think, sometimes in the beginning of this particular stage, it's more of a rejection. It's sort of like, I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I appreciate you, but I'm thinking about things differently. I have these questions to be asked. I don't know what I am, but I'm not that. You see, it's sort of this sort of a negative sort of time of faithing that's happening for them. The positive side begins to say, I don't believe that anymore, but this is the way I'm starting to think about my faithing journey. This is what I believe. This is what I'm leaning into. This is what I'm all about. Another way to think about this, and this probably comes up a lot in your conversations, is at the beginning of part of this phase is sort of the deconstructing piece, right? This is where people are like, I'm just deconstructing my faith. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I don't know what I believe, right? That is actually part of the process, and that is completely okay. The challenge here, though, is we have to remember is that's not the end of the process. That after the deconstruction comes this reorientation, this reconstruction, this rebuilding of something. So I find that as I work with a lot of young adults, for them to say, I don't believe that anymore, I'm kind of like, great, I'm really curious about that. Tell me more about that, right? But then gently, what I'm trying to say to them, so what do you believe? What is the thing that you are aligning with? How does that make sense to you? How are you pulling these things together? And I don't say that in a pejorative way or confronting way. That's not the point. The point is I'm trying to guide them into this later part of this movement to begin to help them construct it. And that is crucially important in their own development as they begin to make sense of things. So deconstruction, completely fine. That's just not the end of the story. That's an important piece that's moving him to the direction. And if we think about last week, it's crucially important because if we only think that it's about the first part of that, the deconstruction piece, that's like Peter being in the middle of the water and is sinking. Like you can only be in like not believing for so long. At some point, you've got to grab hold of something. At some point, you have to think about the things that are animating your life and your values and moving forward. And so what we're trying to do is to call emerging adults into thinking about that and beginning to grab hold of that, which is a challenge for them as well, right? Because now they have to make a new sort of commitment. And that's part of our pastoral process as well. So Fowler and Dallas Parks talk about faith in this way. It's the seeking of pattern, order, coherence, and relation in the disparate elements of our experience, the capacity and demand for meaning, right? So this is where we're talking about this idea of epistemological equilibrium. How am I bringing disparate things together to make sense of the world? They say it's the activity of seeking and discovering meaning in the most comprehensive dimensions of our experience. Okay, so faith is just not like this belief in Jesus. It's this meaning making and beginning to synthesize all that I am, all that I experience, all that I desire, all that I aspire, and try to make sense of that in a really profound way. And this is why faithing is so profound, right? I mean, that's not like a little heady thing that I'm doing. It's something that is actually like deeply, deeply moving and important to me. And so faith is not simply a set of beliefs that religious people do. It's something that all human beings to do. And, quite frankly, I really, really love this. And here's why. Especially in the worlds of young adults and emerging adulthood and the church, I think sometimes we kind of hear this nomenclature of young people leaving the church, or you have people that are in the church or out of the church, and we're worried about one more than the other, however you want to think about that. But what I love about this last bullet is perhaps the starting point is this. Every human being, according to Fowler and Dallas Parks, is faithing. They're trying to make meaning of their lives. They want a life that counts. They want something that's significant. And as I think about that, I kind of go, well, I can start there. I can start there with anybody. If I start with the assumption that they're faithing, that they want to make sense of the world, that they're trying to make it all fit together, when we start there, we can maybe worry less about Christian, non-Christian. We can worry less about believer, non-believer. We can worry less about whether you found your faith or lost your faith or whatever it might be. We actually can kind of say, gosh, we're all in this faithing thing together, aren't we? We all kind of want to live our best lives. We want to somehow find our way. And I feel like we need to give grace and space for each other to do more of that. And to me, that's the space where I want to hang out with people because I think that's where a lot of our emerging adults are as well. Couple other things. When it comes to belief, they say the central work of the young adult life is not located in tasks or circumstances. And consider Arnett's findings for a second, right? Like he talks about this idea that it's not getting married, it's not having a job. They go on and they say the promise and vulnerability of emerging adulthood lie in the experience of the birth of critical awareness and the disillusion of and recomposition of the meaning of self, other, world, and God. Emerging adulthood is a rightful time of asking big questions and discovery worthy dreams. This is where Dallas Parks, I think, nails it, right? So it's not just about achieving tasks, it's about becoming, right? And that sounds a lot like faithing to me. And when it comes to meaning making, another term that you've heard me use, it's really becoming critically aware of one's own composing of reality. It's self-consciously participating in the ongoing dialogue toward truth, right? So it's not just about me, it's with others. And it's cultivating a capacity to respond and to act in ways that are satisfying and just, right? So there's this congruency internally, but it's also something that has expressed itself in the congruency of the way that I live my life. Um, and with that in mind, I just think there's a lot of hope out there. Nancy Tatum Amerman in her book Sacred Stories and Spiritual Tribes says this: if we do not find religion today in the predictable places and the predictable forms as we did before, we cannot assume that it's disappearing. I'm really kind of tired of conversations about supposedly young adults, emerging adults losing their faith. What if instead we were to say, no, they're faithing all over the place. We're just not looking in the right places. They're trying to make sense of the world because they want to live their best lives. And we actually can pay attention to that and maybe give them language to this good news gospel where we can maybe help them make sense of that. That seems like a much more interesting conversation than wringing our hands, wondering if they're in or out, saved or unsaved, or all that comes with that. And I think emerging adults are looking for that. They're looking for some language to help them navigate something that is deep and profound and integrated in their lives. So it makes me think about a couple of things, and maybe you can muse on this before you jump to the next video. How would you respond to the following statements that maybe you've heard in your own communities or congregations? Half of all persons who accept Jesus do so before age 13, and 2/3 made a commitment before age 18. So the implication of that is, so we really got to get them early so, you know, they don't lose the faith when they get older. Might there be a problem with that? That faith doesn't work that way. We don't, you've heard me say this before, we don't gas them up when they're young with Jesus and hope that they make it. If the faithing process is dynamic and changing and looks different, as Fowler Dallas Parks talks about, how might we reimagine what is actually going on here? Or what about this? If we just start teaching kids faith earlier, they wouldn't be in such a spiritual mess when they get to be teenagers and young adults, right? We've talked about this before. Same sort of thing. There's some limitations to this because they're not keeping in mind this idea of faithing. And then what about this? What if we talked more about our faith and where it is now rather than where it started? I'm all excited about people telling me how they discovered Jesus, but you know what I'm more interested in through a faithing lens is to kind of say, so where are you faithing right now? Like, where's the thing that you feel like you are deconstructing or reconstructing? Where's the space where you're leaning in because you think that this is the way that God is leading? And how has that been for you? You see what I mean? Like, I feel like we can have generative conversation about our faithing journey now, rather than just always appealing back to one really important moment that we had a long time ago. So I hope that you find that interesting. Perhaps it gives you some ways to think about your own life, your own journey. and also others that you are working with. So thanks for joining me on this particular video journey. Peace.